Hello students, good morning. Today we are going to start with a concept on a chapter called as sexual reproduction in flowering plants. And in this chapter we are going to deal with a small concept called as pollen grain. Now as already we came across regarding the pollen grain is nothing but it is also called as a male gametophyte. So pollen grain, it is called as male gametophyte. As it forms the male gametophyte, this pollen grain is produced in the anthers. And in the anthers, when the pollen grains are produced, when they are matured, they are shed, and finally they reach the stigma and the process is termed as pollination. Now let's look at the structure of the male gametophyte, where it is called as a pollen grain. Now if we look at the structure of a pollen grain, the pollen grain is made up of two layers. The outer one is called as an exine, and the inner one is called as the intine. Now there are two layers where we call them as exine and intine, and this has two cells, one a smaller one, other a larger one. So pollen grain, it consists of two cells. Okay. Now the outer layer of the pollen grain, this is called as an exine, and the inner layer is called as a intine. So there are two layers in the pollen grains. Outer one is exine and inner one is a intine. Now here we have a cell called as a generative or a vegetative cell. The second one is called as a generative cell. So there are two cells, vegetative and generative cell. Now vegetative cell is larger and generative cell is smaller. Now on the outer part of exine, there might be certain gaps, and these gaps represent the pores, and these are also called as germ pores. Okay, now if we look at the structure of a pollen grain, so what we observe here, the outer layer is called as an exine, inner layer is called as intine, and the exine has certain pores called as germ pores, and inner layer is intine, which is continuous. And if we come across the exine, if you look at the structure of an exine, exine is the outer layer of the pollen grain that is made up of one of the highly resistant substance called as a sporopollenin. So exine is made up of sporopollenin, which is one of the most resistant substance present on the pollen grain. Then this sporopollenin is highly resistant against strong acids, alkalis, as well as high temperatures, and hence this sporopollenin, no enzyme can be degraded. So the sporopollenin, as it is present on the exine layer, it is not at all degraded by any of the enzymes also, even from the enzymes also. Then the exine, it is not continuous, but it has 1 to 3 germ pores, and these germ pores, it helps in germination of the pollen tube, and this is regarding the part of the germ pores. And if we look at the articulation of the exine is not exactly round, the exine is not exactly spherical. The shape will change also, because the size of the pollen grains also change, the shape and the articulation of the exine also changes, because in in the pollen grain, if we look at its size, the size differs from one species to another species. The size, it might be around 25 micrometer to 50 micrometer in its diameter, and hence even the size of the pollen grain also differs from species to species. So the size varies from 25 to 50 micrometer in diameter. Okay, so this is regarding the part of the size of pollen grain. Now, after the exam, let's look at the second structure. Second structure is an intine. Now, when we come across the structure of an intine, intine is the inner layer. It is continuous and it is made up of pectocellulose. Pectin and cellulose. So it is composed of a pectocellulose. Okay. Then inner layer is continuous, exine is a discontinuous. The discontinuous part is called as a germ pore, and in the germ pore, at the region of the germ pore, the sporopollenin is absent, and these germ pores helps in germination of pollen tube through it. Okay, now as we talked about the exine as well as the intine, outer part, inner part, outer layer as well as the inner layer. This exine, as its articulation is different, it might be smooth surface, it might be having some rough surface also, and this exine might be spiny. The arrangement may be like the spines also. It varies from one species to another species. It might be spiny. There might be presence of some pits also, where we call it as a pitted exine layer of the pollen grain. So the outer part, the articulation, the arrangement or the array, it varies from species to species. Okay. Now, what is the use of pollen grain? As we call the pollen grain as the male gametophyte, this is the male gametophyte which is going to fertilize with the egg cell. Okay, then how many cells are present in the pollen grain? There are two cells which are present in the pollen grain. A larger cell is called as a vegetative cell, where it consists of irregular nucleus, and a smaller cell is called as a generative cell, which consists of a smaller nucleus, and this is the male gamete. Now, the nucleus which is present in the vegetative cell is irregularly arranged with a dense cytoplasm. This cytoplasm helps and provides nutrition for the generative cell. Now, in majority, in 60% of the angiosperms, pollen grains are shed at this two-celled stage. One is a vegetative cell, other one is a generative cell. But what happens in the remaining 40% of the angiosperms? In the remaining 40% of the angiosperms, pollen grains are shed at three-celled stage. And what are those three cells? One vegetative cell, and this generative cell undergoes mitosis to divide into two nucleus, forming two nucleus, and hence generative cell will be of two, vegetative cell will be of one, and hence these are the two cells, this is one cell. Remaining 40% of the angiosperms shed the pollen grains at this three-celled stage. So this is regarding the part of the dispersal of the pollen grains at its maturity. So during maturity, pollen grains are shed at a two-celled or a three-celled stage. In 60% of the angiosperms, it is of a two-celled. In a remaining 40% of the angiosperms, the pollen grains are shed at three-celled stage. Okay. Now the question comes, how many germ pores are present in the pollen grain? Now in a pollen grain, let's take the monocots and dicots. If we compare these two, monocots generally have three germ pores, and dicots have one germ pore. And what is the function of the germ pore? It helps in germination of the pollen tube. That means when the pollen tube has to germinate, it develops a tube-like structure. This is called as a pollen tube. And this pollen tube arises from which part of the pollen grain? Yes, It is the exine layer from which the pollen tube develops. From the germ pore, the pollen tube gets developed, and this pollen tube helps in transferring of two male gametes into the embryo sac for the process of fertilization. So this is regarding the structure of the male gametophyte called as pollen grain.